was around 1999 that Cosina acquired the rights to use the Voigtlander name for a series of cameras and lenses. Some of the cameras lacked viewfinders, while a number of them were rangefinder cameras. In 2003, several years after I had rediscovered photography, or at least renewed my interest in photography, I purchased this camera. This was the Rollei 35 RF, RF standing for rangefinder, and 35, of course, referring to the film format, 35 millimeter. This really is a rebadged or slightly, yeah, I guess you could call it rebadged Cosina Voigtlander Bessa R2. I had a Cosina Voigtlander Bessa R. I can't recall what happened to it. I know that I sold it, but I don't recall who I sold it to. I either sold it or I traded it. Perhaps I traded it. In any case, this is one of two Cosina-made rangefinder cameras that I still own. The Rollei differed from the other cameras in that this had this very grippy, not that like smooth texture rubber, but a very eraser, I guess you'd call it eraser-like rubber texture. When the camera was released, it was accompanied by this lens. This was this f2.8 40mm Sonnar. Eventually, there were to be two other lenses released. One was going to be the 50 millimeter planar, and the other was going to be an 80 millimeter planar. The idea was that each lens represented a part of Rollei's history. This would, of course, represent the Rollei 35 cameras, the S versions, S for Sonnar. The 50 millimeter planar would represent the standard 50 millimeter lens that it produced for its line of single lens reflex cameras, and the 80 millimeter planar would represent the standard lens for its line of Rolleiflex twin lens reflex cameras. As far as I know, the 80 millimeter lens was produced, but not the 50, or at least I've been searching and I've never been able to find evidence that a 50 millimeter lens was produced. So let's take a quick look at this camera. As I mentioned, this really is identical, pretty much identical to the Bessa R2. This is an M-mount camera. The Bessa R was a screw mount camera. This lens, however, even though it appears to be an M mount, is really a screw mount with an M mount adapter. Now on the bottom of the camera, you'll notice that it says Rollei Germany, but then it says made in Japan. On the lens, on the bottom, it says made in Germany. I really like using this camera, and I probably will use it again in the future. On the front of the camera, there's not a lot going on. There's no self-timer. You do have a small button, and that's the lens release button. I think I stated that already. This is a unified rangefinder viewfinder, and this is your rangefinder window. What this does is this simply collects light to be able to display your frame lines. It serves no other purpose, and it has no purpose as far as the focusing goes. The top deck is pretty clean. You have your rewind crank. Here you have a frame selector, so instead of having automatically selected frames like many of the Leica M cameras, in this case you would select them by turning this switch. Here's where I mentioned the fact that the camera was planned as a 3-lens set, 80 millimeter, 40 millimeter, and 50 millimeter. Traditional hot shoe does not take a dedicated flash. Any flash unit will work. Here's your shutter speed dial. Available shutter speeds run from 1/2000th of a second down to 1 second plus B, with your film speed indicator window right here. It's the lift and turn variety. So you lift and then turn until you get to your desired shutter speed, then you drop it into place and it locks. This is a soft release that I added, has a small R for Rollei. Without it, it looks like this with a small little concentric green line. I actually like the soft release with this camera. It makes the shutter release stand up just slightly higher. Here's your film advance. This is a ratcheted film advance, but the throw is fairly short. You almost don't need that ratcheted film advance. Still, it's nice to have. This is something that many cameras did away with. This is your film plane indicator. This indicates where your film sits in the camera. On the bottom of the camera, you have several things going on. One, you have your tripod socket, which is in alignment with the center of the lens. You have your press and release rewind button. This is your battery chamber. This camera uses two silver oxide button cells, S76, LR44. And as always, try to use either lithium or silver oxide, and if possible, don't use an alkaline battery. They can always be good in a pinch, but I wouldn't keep them in there. This is a small drive coupling. There was a drive for this. I never purchased it. And this is a small little recessed area, and that would be a locator pin when you attach that manual drive. It's not a battery operated winder. On the side of the camera, you have your flash synchronization socket. Here on the back, once again, pretty plain. You have a window to see what kind of film you have loaded in the camera. You have your Rollei branding, and you have your eyepiece. The eyepiece in this camera, in many of the Cosina Voigtlander cameras, was quite large. Very easy to use, even for eyeglass wearers. Pop open the back, it's fairly simple. Just pull up on your rewind knob. Back pops open. This is a fairly standard setup. Your film runs traditionally from left to right. You have your sprocket wheel, take-up spool, and you have your film rails. This uses a vertically traveling metal shutter, and it used this, I believe, in all of the Voigtlander cameras. Why not? From an economic point of view, certainly makes more sense to just use a single shutter rather than trying to create a different shutter for each camera. Here's your pressure plate, and of course the role of the pressure plate is to keep the film flat against your film rails. So when you take your photograph, you get your film is as flat as possible, and you get as sharp a photo as possible, always dependent upon the taking lens being able to record a sharp image. Note that this camera does not use foam seals, and that's because it's a German camera. And by design, German cameras did not use foam seals. There may have been one or two, but in general, though, you'll rarely see a German camera with foam seals. I stopped buying the Cosina rangefinders after this model, and they continued to produce them. By that point, I think that I had enough Cosina Voigtlander cameras. Let's look at the weight of this camera. So the body by itself weighs 15.9 ounces, or you could say 1 pound. The lens weighs 6 ounces, 6.1 ounces. So that means between the two, you're going to be at, let's see, 10 pounds, 6 ounces, or 10 pounds, 1 pound, 6 ounces? Yes. 1 pound, 6 ounces between the two. That would just be shy of 1.5 pounds, so that's a fairly reasonable weight. As I mentioned, I don't have any other Cosina Voigtlander cameras. However, I will compare its weight to my favorite camera of all time, the Zeiss Icon Contax 2A. We can say this comes in right around 1 pound 9 ounces, or just 3 ounces more than the Rollei 35 RF. The Rollei 35 RF uses tab focusing. I'm not a huge fan of tabs, and with this camera, that is the only option. There's no focusing ring for you to focus manually. Also, you'll notice that here's your aperture ring. It's in the front. And the serrated part doesn't go all the way around. There's a cutout section right here, and that's where it shows you your apertures. The distances are marked both in feet and meters. And this lens has a small depth of field scale. In the viewfinder, you have 3 LEDs. The first is a right-facing arrowhead with a minus sign indicating underexposure. The second is a circular dot indicating correct exposure. And then finally, you have a leftward-facing arrowhead with a plus symbol representing overexposure. This is how the Rollei 35 RF's metering system works. The metering eye actually is angled toward the gray of the shutter curtains, and that very likely is 18% gray. What most meters try to do is they try to collect all the light in a scene, or all the tones in a scene, and then average them to 18% gray. So in this case, it would take the light that's coming through the lens and reflecting off of the shutter curtains and which are 18% gray, and then it reads the amount of light that is reflecting off the curtains and hitting the meter cell. And so you adjust your exposure by either turning your aperture ring or changing your shutter speed. With this camera, in which you set exposure manually, it's always best if you have a basic understanding of the relationship between apertures and shutter speeds. Not required, but it certainly will help you quite a bit. If you're brand new to photography, either watch some videos or read a book. Once in a while, reading a book is okay. I would consider this to be a short throw focus ring. That is, you can go from infinity down to your close focus distance, which is 0.7 meters. 0.7 meters is fairly standard for most rangefinder cameras. In fact, most rangefinder cameras cannot focus closer than 0.7 meters. That seems to be fairly universal among almost all rangefinders, and that probably has to do with the physical limitations of the either mirror or prism rotating within the rangefinder assembly that's under the top deck. Focusing this lens is fairly simple. Although the rangefinder patch is small, it's bright with plenty of contrast and pretty usable in nearly all lighting conditions. This camera came with its own Rollei-branded lens cap, and I'm surprised that I haven't lost it. I've managed to hang on to it, and other than a few scuff marks, or one major scuff mark, it's not dented and not destroyed, so pretty happy about that. There is some loss of paint around the inside of the lens shade. The lens shade itself is very tiny, and you'll see what I mean. It screws onto the outer portion of the lens, allowing you to add filters at any time. This uses 39mm screw mount filters, the same as many Leica lenses. Not all Leica lenses, but many. You can see it makes it very simple then to screw the lens shade around the filter, thereby protecting both the lens and the filter ring. It also doesn't interfere with the addition of the lens cap. Remember that the batteries power only the meter, and if your batteries die, you can continue shooting, although you're going to have to guess on exposure. Like anything that uses batteries, it's always a wise idea to keep a extra set of batteries in your bag. So if the batteries do go dead, it's just a matter of simply swapping them out and popping in a fresh set. Everything about this camera is pretty much right, and Cosina really hit the nail on the head when it created its Bessa cameras. They arrived with the body not too large, not too small, with controls that worked, and everything fell naturally where it should have. The knock against many of the Cosina cameras is rangefinder alignment. For some reason, a lot of these rangefinders seem to either fall or get knocked out of a vertical alignment or horizontal alignment. And to correct that, you really have to remove the top deck, do your work, and then put it back together. I think this camera is out ever so slightly. I haven't messed with it just because I haven't really felt like it. When it comes to the overall look of the camera, I rather like it, although that's very subjective, and you know what I like might not necessarily be what you like. I do like the fact that it's not an overly large camera. You know, it's somewhat compact. It feels well made. I always felt that the quality of construction with this camera was better than its predecessor model, the Bessa R. That could just be a matter of Cosina improving some of the materials that it was using, and some of its manufacturing processes, not specifically having to do with this model. This model differs from the other Cosina Voigtlander cameras in that it has this silver powder coat finish to it. The gray color scheme also offsets it nicely, and that, of course, is both of these are unique just to this camera. That would make sense, because I would think that Rollei wanted something that set it apart from the other Cosina Voigtlander models. For me, this camera I would consider to be right size. That is, not too large, not too small, pretty much the right size. I've shot quite a bit of film with this camera, and I've been very impressed with this Sonnar lens. But that really shouldn't be a surprise. The Sonnar is one of the classic lens designs of all time. I think you'd be very impressed with this. I shot a lot of slide film with this and a good bit of black and white. These are still on the market today, And there on occasion you'll see the lens being sold separately. I'm glad I bought both as a package. I think the body probably today is overpriced, as is the lens. But that's sort of the nature of photography. Certain things really hold their value, and some things do not. If there are a couple quibbles about this, I would say that the noise is that the shutter is louder than I would like it to be. It's not a claptrap, but it is slightly loud. Also, it would have been nice to have a self-timer, even though I rarely use one. But, you know, it's always nice to have that option. Do I miss it? Nah, not really. I can't think of any time that I was shooting this camera and thought, gee, I wish I had a self-timer. But there are times when you have a camera on a tripod and you're shooting, you know, in dim light, when it would be nicer to use a self-timer to release a shutter than to press this down and possibly introduce some vibration. So when I shot this camera, I never encountered any problems, never any hiccups. The shutter has always worked every time I used it. And whenever I pick it up, it always feels familiar to me. And that is probably the best compliment I can always give any camera is, does it feel familiar to you? If there's one bone that I have to pick with digital cameras, it is that if I haven't used it in a while, I usually have to re-familiarize myself with all of the buttons, all of the many buttons. One of the advantages of a simple film camera is you pretty much only have your aperture and shutter speed controls and your shutter release, and that's pretty much it. You can then focus on setting your exposure, which really doesn't take any time at all, focusing, composing your shot, and then taking your photograph. It's not to say that digital doesn't have a place in the world today. However, it's still nice to know that there are still film cameras available that let you focus on the basics of photography without having to worry about filling up memory cards, loss of battery power, etc., etc. Of course, you can always run out of film, or you run to the end of the roll, then you have to change the film. But for those of us who shot film for many years, it's never really been an issue. So my final rating for this camera is 9.0. Its strong point, of course, is its lens, and I think also its design. I really like its design. As I mentioned, aesthetics are always a very personal thing. Generally, it's held up pretty well. There's always that slightly dodgy Cosina Voigtlander rangefinder issue, which is also present in this camera. So that, you know, takes a small hit on its durability and its build quality. Otherwise, I think most people who enjoy using a rangefinder camera would certainly be at home with the Rollei 35 RF. So that brings us to the end of this video. If you enjoyed this content, click on that like button. And if you'd like to make a comment, please do so below, or you can send me an email at contact@camera-talk.net. Don't forget to click on that icon in the lower right corner for more content about cameras and photography. And I hope to see you on the next video.